The hive was abuzz, the metaphorical hive, that is. She thought of herself as the queen bee over everything that she saw, and not just everything that was actually hers. She considered herself in charge of everything she passed by every single day. Some of her friends called it delusions of grandeur, but she really felt like it just was because she was born special. Her name was actually Queen, and she added bee on the end for flair. She liked presiding over many different activities that occurred throughout the day. And sometimes she had to hide the fact that she was in charge because it just didn't work within the social structure. But eventually, she would always have time to explore her own majesty. She had in her mind that there should still be knights and dragons, and that she should be able to stop at a muddy pool and have someone throw their cape across it so that she could pass. That had not yet happened for her. One day, Queen
was minding her own business, as much as she could mind her own business when everyone's business was really hers, at least in her mind, when this large fellow walked by. He was extremely muscular and gross almost in his visage, hairy in his chest that stuck out of his shirt, arms that seemed to bulge out of the sides of his t-shirt. He should have been wearing a muscle shirt, really, because he had a lot to show off. Queenie was intrigued, and her eyes followed him across the path as he walked down in front of her house. He was heading to
the botanical garden. Despite his burly appearance, he loved flowers. And he would go to the botanical garden, which was just down the way from Queen's house, every chance that he got. He had been picked on for this love of flowers as a child, and it was part of the reason that he bulked up as he got older. He had heard of something called muscle milk, and he had read things about Lou Ferrigno and really idolized the Incredible Hulk. But at heart, he was a gentle soul. As he walked in front of Queen's house, which at that point in time, he had no idea who lived there, he did, however, notice a pair of eyes that followed him as he crossed in front. He felt as though it were interested in him, but this was not new because many people noticed when he walked by. He was well over 6 feet tall and topping 250 pounds. He tried to keep himself covered up a bit because he knew that he looked a little intimidating, and he didn't want people to be afraid of him. He walked down the path and went over the mound of dirt that he had to scramble up to be able to get through the back of the botanical garden. He never liked walking all the way around to the front. And as he scrambled up over the ridge, he noticed
that behind him, at some distance and trying to be very discreet, there seemed to be the woman from the house. She seemed to be following him into the garden. Oh, well, she must be a flower lover too, he thought. But then he remembered those eyes that had been following him as he walked by. And he wondered, could she really be following him? So he walked a little faster, on around the great pool that was at the center of the gardens, and down close to the muddy bank, exposed with the recent rains. and he stopped and gazed down at the water lilies, contemplating their beauty and keeping an eye out to the side in case
the woman from the house should walk his way. She was at such a distance he couldn't tell what she looked like and would not have been able to pick her from a crowd later on. She kept her distance and did seem very interested in all of the flowers that were blooming at that time in spring. And Queen had in fact followed him. She had quietly closed her front door and scurried down her steps and tried to keep him far enough away that she could barely see the top of his head as it went over the hill into the back of the botanical garden. And Queen had thought that she was the only one that knew that back entryway. She didn't know that anyone else knew. And it did make her a little wary, especially considering how large this gentleman was. But as she was queen, it was her place to say something. She presided over this botanical garden, even though the city said it was theirs. And she followed him right through that back entryway and stayed at a distance, making sure that he didn't do anything she didn't approve of. It was no matter to her that he was so large. She carried a stun gun in her purse, and she was ready to use it at any time. She noticed that he had stopped at the pond, which was muddy now because it had rained so hard, and he was looking at the water lilies, which she loved. She hoped that he wouldn't hurt them. She ventured a little bit closer to him and could see that even though he was exceptionally big, and usually she liked her men thin, that he was handsome in a way, boyishly handsome almost. And he had this queer look on his face as he gazed at the water lilies, as if he could see something in them that nobody else could see. And so she decided to call out to him, and she said,
"Hey, hi." It was a very self-conscious kind of calling, not very typical for a queen at all. It was usually forthcoming and things, but, well, you know, he was big and kind of handsome, and, well, she might have been a little attracted to him. So she approached him and called out, waving, stepping along the side of that muddy path, and as she was coming up, she stepped a little bit too far on the right. And her foot hit that mud. And she started to fall, to slide. Pulling the other foot next to that didn't do any good. It just threw her off balance more, so that she was soon on her side, sliding down that bank. Well, Mark, who was the big guy's name, saw her going down the bank, and of course his first thought was,
wow, she really got herself in a pickle. Shouldn't have stepped that close, should she? Then he caught himself, and even though his true love was all of the flowers and green things, he could stand people. He had been really bruised from the teasing early on because of his love, and he didn't often associate with people outside of his work. But here was this woman who had really annoyingly found herself slipped right down into the mud. And although he really thought she deserved to stay there, because now he was also thinking that perhaps she had followed him through the back path and was not actually there to be a flower lover at all, that perhaps he should indeed move back and help her up. He considered this for so long without making a move that she said,
"Well, you could help me, you lumbering jerk. It was so like Queenie just to assert herself like that when she was in real trouble and she really needed someone's help. I mean, she could have been a little more demure, but it wasn't her way. No, she yelled out at him. And believe it or not, it got him moving. And he stepped down in, being sure to plant his foot deep into that bank so that he didn't slip. You know, if you push your foot down and far enough into mud, you're eventually going to hit something, or you compress it enough that you got some footing. And he did that. He had his big boots on, so he wasn't too afraid of getting too muddy, or at least he could clean them later. Mm-hmm. And he's able to take 2 steps down the bank then and reach down and kind of grab her hand and help her up, or it was really more like lifting her because she was really in a mess at this point. Lying there half covered in gunk. Feet all stuck. It was no wonder that she was yelling out like that. Well, he got his arms under her shoulders and he lifted her up, kind of carried her and dragged her up to the top of the bank. And when he got her there, she said,
"Well, you could be a little easier, you know." And as soon as it came out of her mouth, she wished she hadn't said it that way. And so she tried again. "You really have got me too tightly there, don't you?" Ugh. Queenie just could not help herself. She thought, "Quickly now, Queenie. 3's the charm. Even if you don't feel like you appreciate him pinching you in this way, you could at least act like you're grateful." So she tried a 3rd time. "Sir, I appreciate you. Thank you ever so much for risking your own self to get me out of this muddy mess." And then she thought she might also apologize for being so rude the first 2 times, but she caught herself before she did that. She didn't want to overdo it. And so Mark, because he was such a kind man, recognized that she was just perhaps a lonely, bitter woman and that she couldn't help herself. And besides, he had met a lot of her kind in his time. Grumpy, angry, flowerless. So he set her down on the dry ground. And as he looked up at her, he was sure those were the eyes. Those were the eyes that followed him as he walked in front of her house. And as he thought back, he thought, maybe I've seen those eyes a time or 2 before. And so he thought he'd ask her. And he did. "Ma'am, have you looked at me as I've walked by your house?" And she said,
"Well, I might have. I might have seen you passing once or twice. Peeped out the blinds at you. You're a big man. I don't find you unhandsome, you know." Well, what could Mark say to that? He just said, "Yes, ma'am." "Well, ma'am, can I help you home? Since that was you, I know where your house is. You don't look like you're really in a fit shape to walk on your own right now. It's going to be a bit hard walking in those shoes covered with mud as they are, and if you take them off, your feet are going to get hurt on these cobbles. So I could kind of study you. If you keep the shoes on, we'll scrape as much mud off as we can, and I'll steady you as you walk home. Could I help you do that, ma'am?" And Queenie said,
"Well, let me just sit here on the bank and think about it for a minute." If there was one thing that was hard for Queenie, it was accepting help. And she certainly never asked for it. She, after all, was in charge of all she saw. She thought maybe if she could consider him one of her subjects, then she could accept the help without sacrificing too much of her pride. And as she sat there in the mud, covered, she started to giggle. And Queenie rarely giggled. She giggled because she could see the humor of the moment. And Queenie had lost her sense of humor a long time ago. It was not safe to find things funny when you're in charge of so much. And Mark asked her, did I say something funny? And she said, no. I think I had lost my sense of humor, and it must have been there in that muddy pool. And now I feel I've gotten it back. And he said, well, I'm glad I could help. And she said, you know, Mark, I think you did. And so she stood up in her muddy shoes after she had cleaned off much of the mud. And she said to Mark,
I'd be pleased if you walked me home. And so he did. And that was the start of the great friendship between that big old org-like man, Mark Bronner, and Queenie Bee.